Welcome to episode 9 of Johnny Does .NET. My name is Johnny Hooibergs, and in this series of videos I will tell you more about my favorite programming platform, .NET. In this episode I will discuss another template that we can use to create .NET web applications, more specifically .NET Blazor web applications. In a previous episode, I already talked about .NET Web Applications, and I also told you that in Visual Studio you can find the templates for these web applications by searching ASP.NET, because ASP.NET is the technology that the .NET platform uses to create web applications, or active server pages, which was the original technology that Microsoft introduced to create dynamic web applications. Now, I talked to you about things like Model View Controller, MVC web applications, Razor Pages web applications, all different versions of the same technology that you can use as developer to create these dynamic web applications. Now, more recently, or just a couple of years ago, Microsoft introduced yet another technology that we can use to create web applications, dynamic web applications. And they called this application platform Blazor. Blazor works very similar to the things that I talked about in the previous episode. And there's actually two versions of a Blazor application. And of course, today I will talk about the differences between these two versions. There is the Blazor server application and there is the Blazor WebAssembly application. Now, let's take the Blazor server application first. I create a new project in Visual Studio by using the Blazor server app template. I give it a name and a location. I'm just going to pick all the default ones, and of course .NET 6 as the current version. So while Visual Studio is creating this for me, I can already discuss what the difference is between Blazor and the things we saw in the previous episode. Now, Blazor is a web technology that creates a dynamic web application based on the single page application structure. So a single page application, a single web page application, is a web application, a dynamic web application that only has a single page. It's in its name, right? So one single page that never needs to be reloaded by your browser. And so in a default dynamic web application concept, we have different pages, and when the user browses between those pages, each page needs to be generated by a server, and that server will send the result to the client, and then the client, the browser, will basically load in the new page for that user. In a Blazor single page application, there is only one page, so the browser only needs to load that page once while you open your website or web application for the first time. And then everything we see inside of that application or that page is a component. And those components can be generated dynamically. So if we look at this Blazor application, we can see on the left-hand side a navigation bar with 3 navigation links, and on the top we can see some kind of title bar. Now, this page has been loaded in by the browser. It's the single page, it's the only page we will see. But of course, using the navigation items, I can navigate between these 3 different pages. Well, they are not really pages, they are components within the same page. So our browser will keep the navigation bar and the top of this HTML page the same. And when we click on one of these 3 links, only the content, the component within this page will be refreshed by using some dynamic code like JavaScript, for example. But we as a C# developer don't need to know about this JavaScript. This will be done for us by the Blazor framework or the Blazor platform. You can also see we have these same kind of pages that we had before in previous examples from previous videos that I did. You have the static home page, which uses a little survey. How is Blazor working for you? And you can fill in this survey. We have that counter page with a button, and if you click this button, the counter will increase. And then you have the fetch data page that will fetch some data from an external service, and it will show that data in a table. Now, enough of this. Let's go to some code, and we can see a very similar project structure. Again, it's a .NET project, so we have that program.cs that initializes our application for us, and it configures the application. And you can see here that it adds the concept of Razor pages and the server-side Blazor technology to our web application builder. Now, if we take another closer look, we can see that there's actually a combination of those CS.html files and Razor files. So the CS.html files, those are the ASP.NET, C# and HTML mixed together into that Razor syntax, where we have the at sign that states that this is C#, and then the HTML intertwined with that. But we also have Razor components. And those Razor components are actual components, and the CS.html files are the page for our application, or the single page for our application. So basically we have the layout page, which is the entire HTML for our single page application, which then dynamically loads in some components. And those components are configured within those Razor files. So I told you we had 3 pages or components accessible from that navigation structure on the left hand side, which was the home or index page, the counter page, or I'm telling you page, but it's actually components. So the home components, the counter component, and then the fetch data component. Now, if you look very closely, you can see that this is HTML, but it also contains HTML tags that are not really HTML tags. Like survey prompt actually does not exist as an HTML tag. This is a dynamically generated HTML tag that links to a different component. So you can create your own components in Blazor, and you can reuse your components throughout all of your other components to make them reusable, basically. So if you want to have the survey prompt on each component or on each page of your application, you can reuse that survey prompt tag. And this tag actually corresponds to another Razor component with the same name. So in shared, or components that I want to share throughout my application, I have access to that survey prompt Razor component. And this component again uses a combination of C# and HTML. So it has some static HTML, and then it has a dynamic title from C#. And this dynamic title is what makes components very cool to use, because now you can have a single component, you can have dynamic parameters in your component, and depending on where you use your component, you can change the data within your component by changing whatever you provide with that parameter. So if you go back to the index Razor component, we can indeed see that we're using the survey prompt component, Razor component, and we're specifying its title. How is Blazor working for you? So if we use the same survey prompt on another page or another component, we can change the title depending on the context. Now, if we look at the counter, for example, again, we can see the Razor syntax here. We can see the @ sign with some C# attached to it. But we can also see that we can have a button, an HTML button, default HTML button, that has the on-click C# event that links to a method called increment count. And the increment count method will basically increase the current count variable with 1. So we will just add 1 to the current value, and then this value, this variable, is also being used inside of our component to show the current count when the user clicks the button. So very important for you to know is that the concept is very similar to what we did with ASP.NET MVC and ASP.NET Razor pages, is that our server will generate these pages, or these components in this case, and we'll send them to our client. So when I basically click continue, this whole page, single page, has been generated by the server, sent to the client. And whenever I make a change in the client, so when I click the counter page, the server will send me only that component to the client, and the client will dynamically load it into the already active page. Whenever I click this button, there will be communication between the client and the server, where the server will generate whatever needs to be generated for the client to see on the server, because it will interpret the C# code. It will increase that counter variable with 1, and it will then send the result back to the client so that the client can render the differences from before up until now. So all of this is still server-client communication, but the user, of course, does not know about this. For the user, this is a very nice and performant working application, because the only thing that I basically need to change dynamically is this piece of text right here. Which is also what you can see when you select something and then click the button, then you can see that the selection disappears on the text that has actually been changed, is being interpreted by the server and then sent to the client, and then the client will refresh only that part of your application, which makes it feel really snappy. For the fetch data, it's the same thing. If you look at the fetch data component, we can see that again we have a Razor page that uses the add if C# code to see if there are any forecasts, yes or no. If there are, I'm going to display a table, and I'm going to for each all of the forecasts and show them into this same table. Now we also have the onInitialized async method, and this method will be called by the Razor framework for us when, or the Blazor framework for us whenever this component has finished initializing. So it basically initializes at the server side, then it calls this method, so we can do some additional things after initialization. And what we are going to do is we are going to call some kind of external service to get some forecasts for us. We store the results in this variable forecasts, and then we basically update the user interface because this automatically updates whenever I change this variable. And then the result is sent to the browser, and the browser will incorporate it inside of its already active single page. So this is a Blazor for you. So it's again very similar to what we saw in ASP.NET MVC or ASP.NET Razor pages. The only difference is that Blazor is used for single page applications, where we have a more snappy user experience, because the page is only being loaded once, and then only the differences in components are being regenerated on the server and then sent to the client. So if you want to create a single page application in .NET, completely in .NET, you can use Blazor, and you can basically create your application or split up your application into different components, and then use those components together to create all of the pages that you need in your application. So with that, I can show you the other kind of Blazor project template, which is Blazor WebAssembly. Now, Blazor WebAssembly looks very similar. You are doing the same thing. You are creating a single page application with components in exactly the same way. I'll show you. You also have those pages, and you have your counter, your fetch data, and your index. And they look completely the same. They are almost exactly the same as with Blazor Server. The only difference is that we don't have any CS.html files. We don't have those Razor CS.html pages, because the most important difference between Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly is that in this case, we are actually going to render most of our application, most of our dynamic web application in the browser itself and not on the server. And because a browser is not able to use the .NET runtime, because a browser is something that uses HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and is platform independent, it doesn't know about .NET. So if we want to write .NET and C# code, the browser does not know how to work with that. But we want to create a technology that actually moves all of this logic from the server to the client So what do we need for that? We need WebAssembly. And WebAssembly is a technology that's been around for some time now. And actually, Microsoft made it happen that the .NET runtime, including your application, can actually run inside of this WebAssembly technology. And because the browser already has support for WebAssembly, the fact that we can run our .NET applications inside of a WebAssembly makes it possible for a browser to actually run .NET code, which is quite cool. Now, the upside to this is the fact that we don't need that client-server communication all the time. Every time the user clicks on a button or does something in the user interface, we don't need to go all the way to the server. The server needs to do all kinds of things and then send the result back. We don't need that. We can do everything client-side. We can do everything in the browser, making our user interface even more snappy than it was before. Now users really think that they are working with like a native application on their system, while it's actually something running in their browser, which is very cool. So yeah, I was talking about the fact that there's no CS.html files here, so there's no web page in CS.html, because CS.html needs to be interpreted by a server, and in our case there is no server. We do everything client-side, or we do most of our things client-side, and that's because, or at least the reason that there's no CS.html files is solved by the fact that we now have a regular HTML file in our www root folder. So this regular HTML file can actually be interpreted by your browser, because your browser is made to interpret HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There is just the HTML file that by default loads everything that we need, like also the Blazor WebAssembly JavaScript files, and they will make sure that our .NET application gets downloaded from the server into the client WebAssembly technology, and then it will run completely client-side. So if I run this, you will see a very small difference. Very small difference, and that is that you can see a loading page just before our application loads. That's the only difference. So I refresh, you can see it's loading my application, and now it's finished loading my application. The reason for this is because with WebAssembly, we need all of the assemblies, all of the native code to be downloaded from the server to the client. And because we are using .NET, we basically need to transfer the whole of our application, including the .NET runtime, to the client so that it can run inside of our browser WebAssembly technology. And that takes some time, because it's a couple of megabytes that needs to be downloaded from the server to the client. But once the application has been downloaded successfully, and I click around right here and I do click me, there is no more server-client communication. Everything is happening in the client. So this click me is actually .NET code in that Razor syntax that's being interpreted by the .NET runtime that is running inside of the WebAssembly technology inside of your browser, completely client-side. So if you have a very complex user interface that has a lot of interactions between components, this is actually a cool technology, because now you can run everything client-side and you don't have that client-server communication that can be slower depending on the internet connection speeds of your users. Of course, you still need that initial download. So if you have a very small application that only has a very few interactions, I'm not sure if WebAssembly is the right thing to use. But if you have a very large, very complex application that needs a lot of performance in its client-side code, the WebAssembly is actually a very powerful technology. Also, the client will cache much of these WebAssembly files. So if you load your applications multiple times from scratch, it will go faster and faster, because your browser will actually cache most of those WebAssembly files that don't change over time. There's of course still one thing that you need to think about. That's the fetch data. This data itself is coming from some external service, some external weather service, for example. So it's very, very important that you know that you can't do something like this client-side, because your data cannot be generated randomly on the client. It needs to come from somewhere on the internet, of course, some external service. But it's still a cool thing that we can run all of our client-side logic in the browser and only fetch the data from external services, because fetching data does not really cost lots of data. Because if you look at this data, for example, if you only send the data between server and client, that's not a lot of bytes. That will go rather quickly. But if I need to re-render the entire component on the server and then send all of the generated HTML to the client, that's going to be more data than only these few numbers. So that's the difference between Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. But of course, this data still needs to come from an external service. So that is also a difference in the fetch data component, where before we were just calling a C# service that lives within our same C# project. But in this case, in the Blazor WebAssembly version, we actually use the HTTP helper. The HTTP helper will be able to get data from an HTTP endpoint from a server, but then only the data. And the data it gets is an array of weather forecasts objects, which is basically a text file that gets deserialized into an array of weather forecasts that only contain the data and not the entire HTML surrounding it. And then Blazor will fix this for us. Blazor will generate a new user interface client side based on that data that lives inside of that forecasts array. So this was Blazor technology to create single page applications, and there's the two versions. There's the server side Blazor, and then there's the WebAssembly client side Blazor. And with that, we reach the end of another Johnny Does .NET video. In this video, I talked to you about Blazor web applications, .NET Blazor web applications. I discussed the difference between Blazor Server and Blazor WebAssembly. And in the next video, I will talk about .NET Web Services. .NET Web Services like .NET Web API or gRPC. Did you like this video? Please don't forget to give me a thumbs up. And if you want to be notified of future videos, please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you again next week.